The security camera footage would later become evidence in 3 separate lawsuits. 7-year-old twins Jake and Danny Rodriguez had cornered their latest caregiver, Mrs. Henderson, against the marble kitchen island of their father's penthouse. Jake wielded a wooden spoon like a sword while Danny hurled handfuls of cereal at her face. The woman's screams echoed through the pristine corridors until she finally broke free and ran for the elevator, leaving behind her purse, her dignity, and her 2-week notice scrawled on the back of a grocery receipt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This was Nanny number 14 in 8 months. Marcus Rodriguez stood in his corner office 40 floors above Manhattan, watching the city blur into twilight while his assistant's voice droned through the speakerphone. The quarterly projections could wait. The merger discussions could wait. Everything could wait except the reality that his sons were systematically destroying every person brave enough to enter their home. The calls from their private school had become daily occurrences. The therapy sessions had devolved into warfare between trained professionals and 2 small boys who seemed to have weaponized their grief into pure chaos. Marcus had built an empire from nothing. Rodriguez Holdings owned half the commercial real estate in 3 states, employed thousands, and generated enough revenue to fund small countries. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals over breakfast and close hostile takeovers with a handshake. But he could not make his own children stop biting strangers. The penthouse had become a war zone disguised as luxury. Imported furniture bore teeth marks and crayon scars. Priceless artwork hung crookedly where small fists had pounded against walls. The marble floors, once pristine enough to host charity galas, now showed permanent stains from various projectiles his sons had launched during their daily campaigns of terror. Even the housekeeping staff had begun demanding hazard pay. 8 months ago, everything had been different. 8 months ago, Sarah had been alive. Sarah Rodriguez had been the gentle force that held their world together. Where Marcus commanded boardrooms with his voice raised and fists clenched, she had whispered bedtime stories and somehow convinced 2 hyperactive boys to brush their teeth without bloodshed. She had been their translator, their mediator, their peace treaty. When cancer took her in the space of 6 brutal weeks, it left behind not just a grieving widower, but 2 children who had lost the only person who truly understood their language. Marcus had thrown money at the problem the only way he knew how. He hired the most expensive nannies from the most prestigious agencies. He enrolled the boys in exclusive therapy programs. He bought them every toy, every game, every distraction that might somehow fill the void their mother had left behind. But money could not purchase what Jake and Danny needed most, someone who could see past their anger to the pain underneath. The boys had developed their own twisted logic. If they could drive away enough caregivers, maybe their father would finally come home. Maybe he would stop hiding behind business calls and late-night meetings. Maybe he would remember that he had children who needed more than trust funds and expensive schools. Their violence was not random. It was strategic. It was a language Marcus had forgotten how to speak. Mrs. Henderson had lasted longer than most, nearly 2 weeks before the cereal incident. She had been a grandmother of 6 with sterling references and 40 years of childcare experience. She had survived toddler tantrums, teenage rebellion, and every conceivable childhood crisis. But she had never encountered anything like the Rodriguez twins. Her resignation letter, discovered later under a pile of scattered Cheerios, contained just 3 words: call social services. That threat finally broke through Marcus's armor of denial. He could lose everything he had built, but he could not lose his sons. Not after losing Sarah. The problem was that every childcare agency in the city had blacklisted his address. Word had spread through the nanny network like wildfire. The Rodriguez penthouse was considered a death trap for anyone foolish enough to accept employment there. It was Marcus's longtime assistant, Patricia, who suggested looking outside traditional channels. She had been fielding the increasingly desperate calls from agencies, watching her boss's empire flourish while his personal life crumbled into chaos. Patricia had raised 3 children of her own, including one who had spent his teenage years in and out of juvenile detention. She understood that some problems required unconventional solutions. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried between merger proposals and investment reports. The sender was someone named Rosa Delgado, responding to an ad Patricia had posted on an underground job board for what she diplomatically termed challenging childcare situations. The message was brief: I specialize in angry kids. I used to be one. Available immediately. There was no resume attached, no list of references, no carefully worded cover letter highlighting years of experience with child development. Just a phone number and an address in Queens. Marcus almost deleted it without responding. He had learned to be suspicious of anyone who claimed they could handle his sons without first meeting them. But something about the directness of the message intrigued him. After 14 failed attempts, perhaps it was time to try something different. Rosa Delgado arrived for the interview on a Thursday afternoon, taking the subway instead of the car service Marcus had offered to send. She emerged from the private elevator looking nothing like the parade of professionally dressed caregivers who had preceded her. She wore faded jeans, steel-toed boots, and a leather jacket that had seen better decades. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands bore small scars that spoke of manual labor rather than childcare certificates. Marcus met her in his home office, gesturing toward one of the leather chairs that faced his imposing desk. Rosa remained standing, her eyes scanning the room with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to assessing potential threats. She took note of the exits, the windows, the heavy objects that could be weaponized by creative children. This was not the behavior of a typical nanny candidate. Tell me about your experience with children, Marcus began, falling back on the script he had used with all the others. Rosa's laugh was short and harsh. Experience? I was in juvie by age 12 for breaking a kid's nose. Spent 3 years in group homes where survival meant learning to fight first and ask questions later. Got my GED in lockup and my first real job at a boxing gym in the Bronx. She paused, studying Marcus's expression. Still think I'm qualified to watch your boys? Most employers would have ended the interview immediately. Marcus had built his career on calculated risks, but hiring someone with a criminal record to care for his children seemed beyond reckless. Yet something in Rosa's directness appealed to him. She was not trying to impress him with false credentials or empty promises. She was offering him honesty, and honesty had become a rare commodity in his world. Why do you want this job? He asked. Because angry kids don't scare me, Rosa replied. I understand their language. Every kid I grew up with was fighting something bigger than themselves. Some fought with their fists, some with drugs, some with complete self-destruction. But underneath all that rage, we were just scared. We needed someone who could handle the storm without trying to fix us. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of crashing glass echoed from somewhere deeper in the penthouse. Both twins had discovered his collection of crystal paperweights and were conducting what sounded like a demolition derby in the main hallway. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over his shoulders. That would be Jake and Danny, he said unnecessarily. Rosa stood up, not toward the door like every other candidate had done when confronted with evidence of his son's destructive capabilities, but toward the sound of chaos. Mind if I introduce myself? Marcus followed her through the penthouse, noting how she moved with the careful awareness of someone who had learned not to be surprised by violence. They found the twins in the living room, standing amid the wreckage of what had once been an expensive coffee table. Jake held a shard of crystal like a dagger while Danny had armed himself with the remnants of a designer lamp. Both boys were breathing hard, their faces flushed with the adrenaline of destruction. You the new lady who's gonna run away? Jake demanded, his voice carrying the practiced cruelty of a child who had learned to strike first. Depends, Rosa said calmly, settling onto the floor cross-legged amid the debris. You guys done breaking stuff, or should I wait? The question caught both boys off guard. Every other caregiver had either fled immediately or launched into lectures about proper behavior and consequences. Rosa simply sat in the wreckage and waited, as if this were the most natural place in the world to have a conversation. Danny lowered his improvised weapon slightly. You're not scared? Of what? A couple of kids with some glass? Rosa shrugged. I've seen scarier things in elementary school cafeterias. Jake stepped closer, testing her boundaries. We made the last lady cry. Yeah? I made my first teacher quit her job. Beat your record by about 10 years. Rosa's tone remained conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than their respective histories of violence. This was not how these encounters usually went. The boys had perfected a system designed to eliminate threats as quickly as possible. They would escalate until the adult either fled or retaliated, proving themselves to be just another enemy in a world that felt hostile and unpredictable. But Rosa was refusing to play by their established rules. You're lying, Danny said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Patterson, 3rd grade. I threw a desk at her because she tried to make me stand in the corner for fighting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rosa examined a piece of crystal, turning it over in her scarred hands. Turned out she was pregnant. Didn't know that until later, but it didn't matter. She transferred to a different school the next week. The twins exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. They had never encountered an adult who admitted to being worse than they were. Every caregiver had positioned themselves as the responsible authority figure trying to reform 2 problem children. Rosa was presenting herself as something else entirely, a fellow survivor of a world that had taught violence as a first response. What happened to you? Jake asked, his hostility giving way to curiosity. Same thing that's happening to you, Rosa said. I was angry about things I couldn't control. Difference was, nobody in my life knew how to help me channel it into something useful. Took me years to figure out that fighting could be something other than destruction. She stood up, brushing glass fragments from her jeans. Your dad's paying me to keep you safe and maybe teach you some things. I'm not here to fix you or make you behave like little angels. But I need to know if you're willing to try something different. Different how? Danny asked. Ever been in a real fight? One with rules and gloves and someone who actually fights back? Rosa asked. Both boys shook their heads, though they tried to hide their interest. Then maybe it's time you learn what real strength looks like. Marcus watched this exchange from the doorway, feeling as though he were witnessing a conversation in a foreign language. He could understand the individual words, but the underlying communication was beyond his comprehension. His sons were not running away or throwing things or screaming. They were listening. For the first time in 8 months, someone had captured their attention without resorting to bribery or threats. Mr. Rodriguez, Rosa said, finally acknowledging his presence. I'm going to need to make some changes around here. These boys need structure, but not the kind you've been trying to give them. What kind of changes? Marcus asked, though he suspected he did not want to know the answer. Physical ones. They need to learn how to use their bodies in ways that won't land them in juvenile detention. They need to understand the difference between fighting and violence. And they need someone who won't flinch when they test boundaries. The rational part of Marcus's mind screamed warnings about liability and proper childcare techniques. But the desperate father in him was willing to try anything that might reach his sons. He had watched them retreat further into anger with each failed intervention. Perhaps what they needed was not someone who would try to eliminate their aggression, but someone who could teach them to direct it. When would you start? He asked. Tomorrow. But I need a few things first. Rosa pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. Equipment, some space cleared out, and your promise that you won't interfere for at least 1 month. These boys need time to trust the process. Marcus took the list, scanning items that looked more suited to a gym than a childcare facility. Heavy bags, boxing gloves in child sizes, protective padding, mats. It read like preparations for war rather than nanny duties. This is highly unconventional, he said. So is hiring someone with my background to watch your kids, Rosa pointed out. But conventional hasn't been working out so well for you. Jake and Danny had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. The prospect of learning to fight, really fight, was more appealing than any toy or game their father had ever purchased for them. They had been throwing punches in the dark, striking out at a world they could not understand or control. Rosa was offering them something different, the chance to learn precision instead of chaos. "Can we start tomorrow?" Jake asked, speaking directly to his father for the first time in weeks. "Please, Dad," Danny added, his usual sullen expression replaced by something approaching enthusiasm. Marcus looked at his sons, really looked at them, and saw something he had not noticed before. Beneath their anger and destructiveness, they were still children. They were still his children. And for the first time since Sarah's death, they were asking him for something instead of demanding it through violence. "All right," he said, surprising himself with the decision. 1 month. Rosa nodded once, a sharp gesture of acknowledgement. "Fair enough. But I need you to understand something, Mr. Rodriguez. This isn't going to be pretty. These boys are going to have to face some hard truths about themselves and why they're so angry. You might not like what comes up in that process. As opposed to what's happening now." Marcus gestured toward the destroyed living room. "Point taken." Rosa turned back to the twins. "Jake, Danny, we start at 7 tomorrow morning. Wear clothes you can sweat in and don't eat a big breakfast. First lesson is learning how to take a hit without falling apart." With that, she headed toward the elevator, leaving the 3 Rodriguez men standing amid the wreckage of Crystal and assumptions. Marcus watched his sons survey the damage they had caused, but instead of the usual defiant pride, he saw something that looked almost like embarrassment. They were beginning to understand that their behavior had consequences beyond simply driving away another caregiver. That night, for the first time in months, the penthouse was quiet. Jake and Danny went to bed without their usual battles over television time or snack privileges. They whispered to each other in their shared bedroom, voices carrying an excitement that had been absent since before their mother's death. They were finally going to learn something that felt real, something that might help them understand the fury that had been consuming them from the inside. Marcus sat in his home office, staring at Rosa's equipment list and wondering if he had just made the best or worst decision of his parenting career. He thought about Sarah and what she would have said about hiring someone with Rosa's background. Sarah had always believed that broken people could help heal other broken people, that sometimes the most damaged individuals were the ones who understood pain well enough to guide others through it. Maybe his sons did not need another person trying to teach them how to behave properly. Maybe they needed someone who could teach them how to survive their own emotions without destroying everything around them. Rosa Delgado was certainly not what he had expected when he started looking for childcare, but she was what his boys had responded to. After 8 months of failure, that response felt like the first sign of hope he had experienced since Sarah's funeral. Tomorrow would bring boxing gloves and heavy bags and lessons in controlled violence. Tomorrow would test whether a former juvenile delinquent could teach his sons something that 14 professional nannies had failed to instill: how to be strong without being destructive. Marcus fell asleep that night with the sound of his children's excited whispers echoing through the penthouse, and for the first time in months, those voices carried hope instead of rage. The delivery truck arrived at 6:30 in the morning, 3 men hauling equipment through the service elevator while the city still slept. Rosa had converted the penthouse's formal dining room into something that resembled a cross between a boxing gym and a therapy office. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling mounts, their leather surfaces worn smooth from years of absorbing punishment. Thick mats covered the marble floor, and mirrors lined one wall to create the illusion of space and allow for technique observation. Marcus stood in his silk pajamas and Italian leather slippers, coffee growing cold in his hand as he watched his elegant dining space transform into something unrecognizable. The mahogany table that had hosted merger negotiations and charity dinner parties now served as storage for an array of protective gear sized for children. Boxing gloves small enough for 7-year-old hands sat beside headgear that looked like it belonged in a medieval armory. Rosa emerged from behind one of the heavy bags, adjusting the chain that secured it to the ceiling mount. She wore the same faded jeans from the day before, but had added a worn tank top that revealed more of the scars Marcus had glimpsed on her hands. These were not the delicate marks of childhood accidents, but the deliberate evidence of someone who had learned early that skin was more expendable than dignity. "The boys awake yet?" she asked without preamble. "I haven't heard them moving around," Marcus replied, still absorbing the transformation of his dining room. "Are you sure this is safe?" Rosa's laugh contained no humor. "Mr. Rodriguez, your sons have been engaging in unsafe behavior for months. Yesterday they weaponized your glassware collection. Today we're going to teach them the difference between anger and aggression, between violence and strength. Trust me, this is the safer option." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake and Danny appeared in the doorway. Both boys had dressed in athletic clothes as instructed, though their excitement was tempered by uncertainty. They had never seen their father's pristine penthouse altered in any way, let alone transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a completely different world. "Whoa," Danny breathed, his eyes wide as he took in the heavy bags and mats. Jake was more skeptical, his natural wariness asserting itself even in the face of promised adventure. "This looks like the place where people get hurt." "People get hurt everywhere," Rosa said matter-of-factly. "In here, we're going to learn how to control when and how that happens. Outside these walls, the world doesn't give you that choice." She gestured for both boys to step onto the mats, her movements economical and precise. "First rule, everything we do in here stays in here. You don't practice these techniques on kids at school, on each other outside of training, or on anyone who isn't wearing gloves and asking for it. Understood?" Both boys nodded, though Marcus could see Danny's fingers twitching with barely contained energy. His younger son had always been the more impulsive of the twins, the one whose emotions translated directly into physical action without passing through any filter of consideration. Second rule, respect the space. We clean up after ourselves, we put equipment back where it belongs, and we never train without supervision. This isn't a playground. It's a laboratory where we're going to study what makes you angry and figure out what to do with that energy. Rosa pulled 2 pairs of child-sized boxing gloves from the table, holding them up for inspection. Third rule, we start slow. I don't care if you think you're tough. I don't care if you've been in fights before. In here, you're beginners until I say otherwise. Jake reached for a pair of gloves, then hesitated. What if we don't want to do this anymore? The question caught Rosa off guard, though she recovered quickly. Then you tell me, and we figure out what you do want to do. But you have to give it a real try first. Not 5 minutes, not 1 session. A real try. How long is a real try? Danny asked. Long enough to learn something about yourself that you didn't know before, Rosa said. For some people that takes weeks. For others, years. Depends on how honest you're willing to be about what's really making you angry. She began wrapping Jake's hands with cloth strips, her movements gentle but efficient. Tell me about the last time you hit someone who wasn't a caregiver or your brother. Jake shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. There was this kid at school. Kevin. He said something about Mom. What did he say? That dead people can't come to parent-teacher conferences. Jake's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. So I punched him in the face. Rosa nodded as if this were the most reasonable response in the world. How did that feel? Good. For like a second. Then it felt worse. Why worse? Jake struggled to articulate something he had never been asked to examine. Because he was right. She can't come to anything anymore. And hitting him didn't change that. Rosa finished wrapping his hands and moved on to Danny, who had been listening to his brother's confession with growing agitation. What about you? Who have you hit? Lots of people, Danny said defiantly. Anyone who looks at me wrong. And does it work? Do they stop looking at you wrong? Sometimes. What about the other times? Danny's defiance cracked slightly. They look at me like I'm crazy. Like there's something wrong with me. Is there something wrong with you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Both boys had been told repeatedly by therapists and school counselors that their behavior was inappropriate, that they needed to learn better coping mechanisms, that their anger was a problem to be solved. but no one had ever asked them directly whether they believed something fundamental was broken inside them. "I don't know," Danny admitted finally. "I think there's something wrong with everyone," Rosa said, pulling on her own gloves. "The difference is some people learn how to use what's wrong with them to become stronger. Others let it destroy everything they touch." She moved to stand in front of one of the heavy bags, settling into a stance that spoke of years of training and countless hours of practice. "Watch my feet. Watch my hands. Watch how I breathe." Rosa's first punch landed with a sound like thunder, the heavy bag swaying under the impact despite its considerable weight. Her second punch followed immediately, then a third, each strike flowing into the next with mechanical precision. She was not simply hitting the bag. She was having a conversation with it, each punch a statement about control and power and the difference between destruction and discipline. "Your turn," she said, stepping aside. Jake approached the bag tentatively, his wrapped hands feeling strange inside the oversized gloves. His first punch was weak and poorly aimed, glancing off the side of the bag without making any significant impact. He pulled back his hand, shaking it as if the contact had hurt. "Again," Rosa said. His second attempt was harder but still lacked technique. The bag barely moved, and Jake's frustration was immediately visible in the tension of his shoulders and the set of his jaw. "You're trying to hurt the bag," Rosa observed. "That's not the point. The bag doesn't have feelings. It doesn't care if you're angry at it. You need to think of it as a target for your technique, not your emotions." She positioned herself behind Jake, adjusting his stance and the angle of his shoulders. "Feel the difference? Your power comes from your whole body, not just your arms. Try again." This time, Jake's punch landed with authority, the satisfying impact sending vibrations up through his arms and into his core. The bag swayed properly, and he felt something shift inside his chest. This was different from hitting Kevin at school or destroying furniture in his room. This felt intentional rather than desperate. Danny could barely contain himself as he waited for his turn. When Rosa finally nodded in his direction, he approached the bag like a small hurricane, throwing wild punches with all the fury he had been accumulating for months. His technique was non-existent, but his enthusiasm was undeniable. "Stop," Rosa said after letting him exhaust himself for 30 seconds. Danny pulled back, breathing heavily, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air flowing through the penthouse windows. "What did you accomplish just now?" Rosa asked. "I hit it a lot of times," Danny panted. "Did you feel better?" Danny considered this question seriously, taking internal inventory of his emotional state. "Not really. Just tired." "That's because you were fighting the bag instead of using it. The bag is a tool. Like a hammer or a saw. If you don't use a tool correctly, it doesn't work the way it's supposed to." She demonstrated again, this time breaking down each component of the movement. The rotation of her hips, the extension of her arm, the precise moment of contact when all the force of her body transferred into the target. It was poetry written in violence, a controlled explosion that spoke of years spent learning to channel chaos into something beautiful and terrible. Marcus watched this instruction from the doorway, fascinated despite his reservations. He had seen his sons' anger countless times, witnessed their capacity for destruction and their talent for emotional warfare. But he had never seen anyone treat their fury as raw material for something constructive. Rosa was not trying to eliminate their aggression. She was trying to refine it. "Mr. Rodriguez," Rosa called without turning around. "You want to try?" The invitation caught him completely off guard. "I'm not really dressed for it." "Neither were your boys the first time they threw a punch. Sometimes you work with what you have." Marcus looked down at his silk pajamas and Italian slippers, then at his sons who were watching him with expressions he could not quite read. They had never seen their father do anything that might be considered physically demanding. His battles were fought in conference rooms and over phone calls. His weapons were contracts and leverage and the ability to destroy careers with a few carefully chosen words. "I don't think that's appropriate," he began, but Jake interrupted him. "Come on, Dad. Rosa showed us. You should try too." There was something in his son's voice that Marcus had not heard in months. Not defiance or anger or manipulation, but genuine enthusiasm. Jake wanted to share this experience with him, wanted to include him in something that had captured his interest. Marcus removed his slippers and approached the bag in his stocking feet, feeling ridiculous but unable to disappoint his son's rare moment of connection. Rosa handed him a pair of gloves, and he pulled them on with the same careful attention he brought to signing important documents. "Remember, it's not about anger," Rosa coached as she adjusted his stance. "It's about control. You're not trying to hurt anything. You're practicing precision." Marcus's first punch was embarrassingly weak, barely disturbing the bag's stillness. His second was slightly better, though his form was terrible and his balance was questionable. By his third attempt, he was beginning to understand the satisfaction his sons had discovered. There was something primal and honest about the direct transfer of energy from his body into the target, something that felt more authentic than any business negotiation he had ever conducted. "Good," Rosa said, and Marcus felt an unexpected flush of pride at her approval. "Remember that feeling. That's what focused energy feels like. Your boys have been scattering their energy in every direction, trying to hit targets they can't even see clearly. We're going to teach them to aim." The morning session continued for another hour, with both boys taking turns practicing basic punches and footwork while Marcus watched from an armchair that had been repositioned to provide a clear view of the training area. He found himself genuinely interested in Rosa's instruction methods, the way she balanced encouragement with correction, the way she treated his son's questions with respect rather than condescension. Jake proved to have natural timing and coordination, though he was hesitant to commit fully to any movement that might result in failure or embarrassment. Danny possessed raw enthusiasm but struggled with patience and precision, wanting to advance to more complex techniques before mastering the basics Rosa insisted upon. "Fighting is just conversation with different rules," Rosa explained as she helped Danny adjust his stance for the 10th time. "You have to listen to what your opponent is telling you with their movements, and you have to be clear about what you're saying with yours. If you're just throwing punches randomly, you're not communicating. You're just making noise." By the end of the session, both boys were exhausted but energized, their usual restless agitation replaced by the satisfied tiredness that comes from physical exertion directed toward a clear goal. They helped Rosa put away the gloves and straighten the mats without being asked, treating the equipment with a respect they had never shown for their destroyed toys and furniture. "Same time tomorrow?" Rosa asked as she gathered her things. "Can we do it twice tomorrow?" Danny asked eagerly. "Once a day, every day, until you've learned what you need to learn," Rosa replied. "Training isn't about doing more. It's about doing better." After she left, Marcus found himself alone with his sons for the first time in weeks without the buffer of a caregiver or the distraction of their destructive behavior. They sat together in the transformed dining room, surrounded by the unfamiliar equipment that had somehow made their family feel more like a team than it had since Sarah's death. "Did you like it?" Jake asked his father. "I did," Marcus admitted, surprised by the truth of his answer. "Did you?" "It was different from hitting Kevin," Jake said thoughtfully. "Better, I think." "How was it better?" Jake struggled to articulate the difference, his 7-year-old vocabulary inadequate for the complex emotions he was processing. "It felt like I was learning something instead of just being mad." Danny nodded vigorously in agreement. "And Rosa didn't act like we were bad for wanting to hit things. She just taught us how to hit them right." That afternoon, Marcus found himself thinking about the morning's training session instead of the quarterly projections that demanded his attention. He had watched his sons transform from agents of chaos into students eager to learn something challenging and demanding. Rosa had not accomplished this transformation through bribery or threats or appeals to their better nature. She had done it by acknowledging their anger as legitimate and then teaching them to use it constructively. The concept was revolutionary in the context of Marcus's parenting experience. Every expert he had consulted had focused on eliminating his son's aggressive behavior, treating their anger as a problem to be solved rather than a resource to be developed. Rosa was operating from a completely different philosophical framework, one that accepted violence as a natural human capacity that could be channeled rather than suppressed. Marcus realized that he had been approaching his son's behavior from the perspective of damage control rather than skill development. He had been trying to minimize their impact on the world around them rather than teaching them to direct their energy toward meaningful goals. The distinction felt profound, though he was not yet sure what it meant for their long-term development. The boys' behavior throughout the rest of the day was markedly different from their usual patterns. They still had disagreements and moments of frustration, but their conflicts lacked the explosive quality that had characterized their interactions for months. When Danny became angry about Jake's choice of television program, he did not immediately resort to physical retaliation. Instead, he clenched his fists and took several deep breaths, as if practicing techniques Rosa had not yet taught him. "I want to hit something," Danny announced during dinner. "Then we'll hit something tomorrow morning," Jake replied matter-of-factly. Marcus stared at his sons, wondering when they had learned to have conversations about their anger rather than simply acting on it. The change was subtle but unmistakable. They were beginning to see their aggression as something they could control and direct rather than something that controlled them. That evening, as he tucked them into their beds for the first time in months without a preceding battle over bedtime routines, Marcus asked them what they thought about their new caregiver. "She's not really a caregiver," Jake said with the precision that occasionally reminded Marcus of his deceased wife's analytical mind. "She's more like a teacher." "What's she teaching you?" Marcus asked. "How to be strong without being mean," Danny answered promptly. The simplicity of his son's response contained layers of meaning that Marcus was still processing as he closed their bedroom door and walked to his home office. For the first time since Sarah's death, the penthouse felt peaceful rather than fragile. His sons were sleeping without the assistance of exhaustion from hours of destructive behavior. They were sleeping because they had spent their energy on something that felt productive and meaningful. Marcus opened his laptop and began researching childhood aggression and therapeutic approaches to behavioral problems. What he discovered challenged many of his assumptions about appropriate interventions for children dealing with grief and trauma. Traditional approaches focused on teaching emotional regulation and conflict resolution through talking and behavioral modification. But several studies suggested that physical outlets for aggressive energy could be more effective for certain types of children, particularly those who had experienced significant loss or trauma. Rosa's approach was not as unconventional as he had initially thought. It was simply unconventional within his wealthy, educated social circle where children were expected to process their emotions through words rather than actions. But his sons had never been particularly verbal about their feelings. They had always been physical in their responses to frustration and disappointment. Perhaps they needed someone who could meet them where they were rather than where conventional wisdom said they should be. Marcus found himself looking forward to the next morning's training session with an anticipation he had not expected. He wanted to see what else his sons might learn about themselves in Rosa's makeshift gymnasium. More than that, he wanted to continue learning alongside them. The feeling of his fist connecting with the heavy bag had awakened something in him that he had forgotten existed, a directness and honesty that felt like a relief after months of careful negotiations with his own children. The next morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in New York, golden sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows and illuminating the training equipment that had become such a focal point of their daily routine. Rosa arrived precisely at 7, carrying a small duffel bag that she set down beside the mats without explanation. "How are you feeling?" she asked the boys as they gathered around her, already dressed in the athletic clothing that had replaced their usual school uniforms for the early morning hours. "Sore," Jake admitted, rubbing his shoulders. "Good sore or bad sore?" Rosa asked. "Good sore, I think. Like I used muscles I didn't know I had." "That's exactly right. Your body is getting stronger, but strength takes time to build. Today we're going to work on something different." She unzipped the duffel bag and withdrew several items that looked more like art supplies than boxing equipment. Notebooks, colored pencils, and what appeared to be a small digital camera. "Before you can fight effectively, you need to understand what you're fighting," Rosa explained. "Most people throw punches at shadows, at things they can't see clearly. We're going to make the invisible visible." She handed each boy a notebook and a set of colored pencils. "I want you to draw your anger." Not what makes you angry, but what the anger itself looks like inside your body. Where do you feel it? What color is it? What shape does it take? Danny immediately began sketching with red pencil, his drawing taking the form of jagged lightning bolts that seemed to emanate from his stomach and spread throughout his torso. Jake was more hesitant, studying his blank page as if it were a complex mathematical problem requiring careful consideration. There's no wrong answer, Rosa assured him. Anger looks different for everyone. Jake finally began drawing with a black pencil, creating what looked like a dense cloud that filled most of the page. Within the cloud, he added smaller shapes in different colors, as if his anger contained multiple distinct components that he was trying to identify and categorize. Marcus watched this exercise from his usual observation position, fascinated by his son's attempts to visualize their internal experiences. He had never considered that emotions might have visual or spatial qualities, that they might be something that could be mapped and studied like geographical features. Now tell me about your pictures, Rosa said after giving them several minutes to work. Danny held up his drawing proudly. Mine is like lightning. It starts here, he pointed to his stomach, and then it goes everywhere really fast. And it's hot and it makes me want to move. What kind of movement? Fast movement. Like running or jumping or hitting things. Rosa nodded approvingly. That makes sense. Lightning wants to discharge its energy quickly. What about yours, Jake? Jake showed his drawing more reluctantly. Mine is like a storm cloud. It's heavy and it sits on me and makes everything darker. And there are different things inside it. What kinds of things? Sad things. Mad things. Scared things. They're all mixed up together so I can't tell which is which. Rosa studied his drawing with the same serious attention she brought to analyzing their boxing technique. That sounds complicated. Do you think it might be easier to deal with your anger if you could separate those different feelings? Maybe. But I don't know how. That's something we can work on. Sometimes when feelings get tangled up together, physical activity helps sort them out. When you're punching the bag, pay attention to which feelings are strongest. She took the small camera from her bag and handed it to Danny. I want you to take pictures of things that make you feel the lightning anger. Not people, just things. Objects, places, situations. Danny accepted the camera with reverence, as if he had been entrusted with an important mission. Like what? Whatever you notice. Maybe something at school, or in the apartment, or just walking around the city. The goal is to start recognizing your anger triggers before they make the lightning start. She gave Jake the colored pencils. You're going to keep drawing the storm cloud, but every day I want you to try to separate one feeling from the cloud and draw it by itself. See if you can figure out what that feeling looks like when it's not mixed up with all the others. Marcus found himself wishing he had a notebook of his own. The idea of visualizing his emotional states was foreign but intriguing. He had spent most of his adult life treating feelings as distractions from more important concerns, obstacles to be overcome rather than information to be processed. What does your anger look like, Rosa? Jake asked with the directness that children sometimes displayed when adults least expected it. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, considering whether to answer the question with the kind of honesty she demanded from her students. Mine used to look like a forest fire. It would start with one small flame and then spread until it burned everything down. I couldn't control it and I couldn't stop it once it started. What does it look like now? Danny asked. Now it looks more like a campfire. Still fire, still hot, still powerful. But contained. Useful. Something I can use to cook food or stay warm or light the darkness. Both boys absorbed this information with the gravity of students receiving instruction in an advanced subject. They understood that Rosa was sharing something important about herself, something that connected to their own experiences in ways they were still learning to recognize. Can we learn to make ours like campfires too? Jake asked. That's exactly what we're going to learn, Rosa replied. But first we have to understand the difference between anger that helps and anger that hurts. Sometimes you need the forest fire. Sometimes the campfire is enough. The important thing is choosing which one to use. The morning's physical training was more focused than the previous day's session. Rosa introduced basic defensive techniques, teaching the boys how to protect themselves while maintaining balance and awareness of their surroundings. She emphasized the importance of breathing and timing, showing them how panic and rushing led to poor technique and increased vulnerability. Fighting is not about who hits hardest, she explained as she demonstrated proper blocking positions. It's about who stays calm longest. The person who panics first usually loses, even if they're stronger or faster. Jake proved to be naturally defensive-minded, more interested in learning to avoid damage than to inflict it. Danny remained aggressive in his approach, but Rosa was gradually teaching him to channel his intensity into precision rather than wild swinging. "Danny, you're still trying to hit the bag as if it insulted your mother," Rosa observed after watching him throw a series of increasingly frantic punches. "Remember, the bag is not your enemy. It's your partner. It's helping you learn." "But it feels good to hit it hard," Danny protested. "It feels good because you're releasing energy that's been building up inside you. But if you only know how to release energy through maximum force, you'll never learn control. Control is what separates fighting from violence." She had Danny practice throwing punches at half power, focusing on technique rather than impact. At first, he resisted the limitation, frustrated by the artificial constraint on his natural intensity. But gradually he began to appreciate the precision that slower movement allowed, the way he could feel each component of the technique and adjust his form in real time. "Better," Rosa said after he completed a series of controlled jabs. "How did that feel different?" "Weird. Like I was holding back." "You were. But you were also learning. Sometimes holding back is the strongest thing you can do." Marcus found this lesson particularly relevant to his own experience. He had built his career on never holding back, on bringing maximum force to every negotiation and business conflict. But watching his son discover the power of restraint made him wonder what he might learn from a more controlled approach to his own challenges. The morning session ended with a brief meditation exercise that Rosa called listening to your body. She had the boys lie on the mats and pay attention to their breathing, their heartbeat, and any areas of tension or discomfort they could identify. "Your body knows things your mind hasn't figured out yet," she explained as they settled into stillness. "If you learn to listen, it will tell you when you're getting angry before your anger takes control." Jake took to the meditation naturally, his tendency toward overthinking serving him well in an exercise that required careful attention to internal signals. Danny struggled with the forced inactivity but managed to remain still for several minutes, longer than Marcus would have thought possible given his son's usual restless energy. After Rosa left and the boys had showered and changed for school, Marcus found himself alone in the transformed dining room, surrounded by equipment that had become familiar in just 2 days. He pulled on a pair of gloves and approached the heavy bag, remembering Rosa's instructions about breathing and technique. His punches were still awkward and weak compared to Rosa's demonstrations, but he could feel improvement in his form and timing. More importantly, he could feel the same satisfaction his sons had discovered, the honest pleasure of physical exertion directed toward a clear goal. As he worked, Marcus found himself thinking about the drawings his sons had created, the way they had visualized their anger as distinct entities with specific characteristics and behaviors. He wondered what his own anger might look like if he attempted to draw it. Probably something sharp and metallic, he thought. Something designed to cut rather than burn. The revelation that emotions could be studied and understood rather than simply experienced or suppressed felt revolutionary. Marcus had spent most of his life treating his feelings as inconveniences to be managed rather than information to be processed. But Rosa was teaching his sons to approach their anger as scientists might approach any other natural phenomenon, with curiosity rather than judgment, with the goal of understanding rather than elimination. That afternoon, Jake came home from school with several photographs on Danny's camera, images of broken playground equipment and graffitied walls that apparently triggered his lightning anger. Danny returned with a new drawing of his storm cloud, this time with one section separated and labeled "Missing Mom" in his careful 7-year-old handwriting. "Look, Dad," Jake said, showing Marcus the pictures. Rosa was right. When I see broken things, it makes the lightning start. I never noticed that before. What do you think that means? Marcus asked. Maybe I get angry when I see things that are broken because Mom is broken too. I mean, not broken, but gone. And I can't fix it. The insight was devastating in its simplicity and accuracy. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he realized that his son had identified a connection that months of expensive therapy had failed to reveal. Jake's anger was not random or pathological. It was a logical response to his powerlessness in the face of irreversible loss. That's a very smart observation, Marcus said carefully. What do you think we should do with that information? I don't know yet. But Rosa says understanding something is the first step to controlling it. Danny showed his father the separated section of his storm cloud drawing, explaining that he had been able to identify his sadness about their mother as distinct from his general anger about everything else. It's still sad, Danny said matter-of-factly. But it's not as heavy when it's by itself. The storm cloud is smaller now. Marcus stared at his 7-year-old son's artwork, amazed by the sophistication of the emotional analysis it represented. Danny had somehow learned to dissect his own internal experience and examine its component parts. This was advanced psychological work being conducted by a child who had been dismissed as simply disruptive by most of the adults in his life. That evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised him. Instead of retreating to his home office to work on business matters, he sat with his sons at the kitchen table and drew his own version of anger. His drawing was indeed sharp and metallic, resembling a collection of blades arranged in a defensive formation around a small, vulnerable center. What's in the middle? Jake asked, studying his father's artwork with professional interest. Marcus looked at his drawing and realized he had unconsciously placed something at the center of all those protective blades, something small and fragile that needed to be defended. I think it's you too, he said quietly. I think my anger is trying to protect you, but it's also keeping everyone else away. His sons absorbed this admission with the same gravity they brought to Rosa's lessons. They were learning that emotions were complex and often contradictory, that anger could serve protective functions even when it caused problems. Maybe we can learn to make your anger into a campfire too, Danny suggested with the optimism of a child who had not yet learned that adult problems were more complicated than childhood ones. Maybe we can, Marcus agreed, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he believed that change might actually be possible. 3 weeks into their training regimen, the first real test arrived in the form of a phone call from Jake and Danny's school principal. Marcus answered while reviewing quarterly reports, expecting another complaint about classroom disruption or playground altercations. Instead, he heard something that made him pause mid-sentence during a conference call with his board of directors. Mr. Rodriguez, I'm calling with what I suppose you could call good news, Principal Harrison said, her voice carrying a bewilderment that Marcus had never heard before. Jake broke up a fight today instead of starting one. The words seemed to hang in the air like a foreign language Marcus needed time to translate. His sons had never been peacemakers. They had been the children other parents warned their kids to avoid, the ones who turned playground disputes into full-scale warfare. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? 2 fifth graders were fighting over a soccer ball during recess. Instead of joining in or making it worse, Jake stepped between them and suggested they take turns with 10-minute intervals. When they argued about who would keep time, he offered to be the neutral timekeeper. Principal Harrison paused, as if she were still processing the incident herself. Danny backed him up. They both stood there like little referees until the older boys agreed to the compromise. Marcus felt something strange happen in his chest, a loosening of tension he had not realized he was carrying. Were there any consequences? Any issues afterward? None. The 5th graders actually thanked them. One of the other teachers asked me if we had enrolled the twins in some kind of leadership program. After ending the call, Marcus found himself staring out his office window at the city below, trying to reconcile this report with everything he thought he knew about his sons. Jake and Danny had spent months treating conflict as an opportunity for destruction. Now they were apparently treating it as a problem-solving exercise. He left work early that day, something he had not done since Sarah's funeral. When he arrived at the penthouse, he found Rosa and the boys in the middle of what she called scenario training. She had set up a series of role-playing exercises using stuffed animals and action figures to represent different types of conflicts. What happens if the bear is angry because the robot took his favorite spot on the couch? Rosa asked, manipulating the toys like a puppeteer. The bear could ask the robot to move, Jake suggested. Maybe they could share the couch. What if the robot says no? Rosa continued. Then the bear has to decide if it's worth fighting about, Danny chimed in. Maybe the robot was there first and the bear should find a different spot. Marcus watched this exercise with fascination. His sons were practicing emotional regulation through play, learning to consider multiple perspectives and outcomes before resorting to physical solutions. The complexity of their analysis rivaled discussions he had witnessed in corporate mediation sessions. What if sharing doesn't work and talking doesn't work? Rosa pressed them. Then maybe the bear needs to walk away and cool down, Jake said. Like we do when we feel the lightning or the storm cloud getting too big. And if the bear can't walk away? Both boys considered this more challenging scenario. Danny spoke first. Then the bear has to decide what kind of fight it wants to have. A smart fight or a dumb fight? What's the difference? A smart fight has rules and ends when someone wins or gives up. A dumb fight just keeps going until everyone gets hurt and nothing gets solved. Rosa nodded approvingly. Good analysis. What kind of fight did you boys have at school today? Marcus realized she already knew about the playground incident, probably through some network of communication that existed between caregivers and educators. She had been preparing for this conversation, using the boys' real-world success as a foundation for deeper learning. We didn't have a fight, Jake corrected her. We stopped a fight. How did that feel? Weird, Danny admitted. Usually when I see people fighting, I want to join in. But today I wanted to make it stop. What made the difference? Jake answered thoughtfully. I remembered what you said about fighting being like a conversation. Those kids weren't really talking to each other. They were just being loud. So you helped them start talking instead of just making noise, Rosa summarized. Yeah. And it worked better than punching. Marcus felt a surge of pride that was immediately followed by an unfamiliar emotion he struggled to identify. It took him several minutes to recognize it as hope. Not hope for his son's future, which had been abstract and distant, but hope for their present, for the family they were becoming rather than the family they had lost. That evening, Marcus made another departure from his usual routine. Instead of disappearing into his home office after dinner, he asked his sons if they wanted to watch a movie together. They chose an animated film about superheroes, and Marcus found himself paying more attention to their commentary than to the plot. That guy's anger looks like a volcano, Danny observed during a scene featuring a particularly rage-driven villain. Yeah, but he's letting it control him instead of controlling it, Jake added. Rosa would say he needs better technique. They were applying their emotional training to everything they encountered, treating their anger management skills as tools they could use to understand the world around them. Marcus realized that Rosa had not simply taught them to control their behavior. She had taught them to analyze human conflict as a subject worthy of study and mastery. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Marcus opened the door to find two of his son's former classmates accompanied by their mothers, all looking somewhat nervous about their unannounced appearance at the penthouse. We heard that Jake and Danny have been learning some kind of special program, one of the mothers explained. My son Kevin has been having anger issues since his parents' divorce, and we were wondering if we could speak with whoever has been working with your boys. Marcus was stunned. These were families who had previously avoided his sons, parents who had requested that Jake and Danny be placed in different classes to minimize disruption. Now they were seeking advice about childhood anger management from the very children they had once considered problematic. Rosa emerged from the training room wearing her usual jeans and tank top, looking utterly unfazed by the unexpected audience. She listened to the parents' concerns with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, asking questions about their children's specific triggers and behavioral patterns. Anger isn't a character flaw, she told the group of anxious mothers. It's an energy source that most kids don't know how to use effectively. The problem isn't that they're angry. The problem is that nobody has taught them what to do with that anger besides suppress it or express it destructively. She invited the visiting children to observe a training session, with their parents' permission. Marcus watched as Jake and Danny demonstrated their techniques with the pride of students who had mastered a difficult subject. They explained the difference between forest fire anger and campfire anger, showed off their emotional mapping drawings, and taught the younger boys some basic breathing exercises. The important thing is practice, Jake told Kevin with the authority of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. You can't just learn it once and be done. You have to keep working on it every day. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of hosting what amounted to an informal parenting consultation in his living room. The other fathers were asking him questions about Rosa's methods, about the equipment costs, about whether he had seen measurable improvement in his son's behavior. They're not the same children they were a month ago, Marcus told the group honestly. Not just their behavior, but their entire approach to problem-solving has changed. They think before they act now. They consider consequences. They look for solutions instead of just reacting to problems. One of the mothers asked if Rosa would be willing to work with other families. Marcus looked to Rosa, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor teaching breathing techniques to 3 7-year-olds with the patience of someone who had found her calling. I'd have to think about it, Rosa said when the question was posed to her directly. Every kid is different. What works for Jake and Danny might not work for someone else. But the principle would be the same, wouldn't it? Another parent pressed. Teaching them to channel their anger instead of trying to eliminate it? The principle, yes. But the methods would need to be customized. Some kids need boxing. Others might need martial arts, or dance, or rock climbing. The goal is finding a physical outlet that matches their personality and gives them a sense of mastery. After the impromptu gathering dispersed, Marcus found himself alone with Rosa while the boys played quietly in their room. This was the first time since her arrival that they had been in the same space without the buffer of training activities or his son's constant presence. You realize what just happened here, don't you? Marcus asked. A bunch of desperate parents looking for solutions, Rosa replied pragmatically. No. A bunch of parents recognizing that my sons have become leaders instead of problems. Children who were once considered disruptive are now being asked to mentor other children. Rosa shrugged, but Marcus could see that she was pleased by the recognition. They've learned to use their strength to help instead of hurt. That's what strength is supposed to be for. Is that what you learned? In all those group homes and juvenile facilities? Rosa was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus wondered if he had overstepped some boundary by asking about her past. But when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone sharing a truth she rarely revealed. I learned that angry kids usually have good reasons to be angry. The world fails them in specific ways, and then punishes them for reacting to those failures. I spent years being told that my anger was the problem, when really the problem was that I didn't have any healthy ways to express it. When did that change? When I met a boxing coach who told me that anger could be fuel if I learned how to burn it cleanly. He taught me that the difference between a fighter and a bully is purpose. Fighters train to become better. Bullies just hurt people because they're hurting. Marcus absorbed this distinction, thinking about his own relationship with power and aggression in the business world. He had spent his career using intimidation and force to achieve his goals, but he had never considered whether his methods served a larger purpose beyond personal advancement. What's the purpose for Jake and Danny? He asked. They're learning to protect instead of destroy. To lead instead of dominate. To use their intensity as a gift instead of a curse. Rosa paused, studying Marcus with the same analytical attention she brought to evaluating his son's progress. What's your purpose, Mr. Rodriguez? The question caught him off guard. He had built an empire, accumulated wealth, achieved everything that conventional wisdom suggested should constitute success. But he realized that he had never articulated a purpose beyond acquisition and expansion. I don't know, he admitted. I used to think it was providing for my family. After Sarah died, I thought it was just survival. Maybe it's time to figure that out. Your boys are watching you just as much as they're watching me. They need to see what it looks like when a man uses his strength for something meaningful." That night, Marcus lay awake thinking about Rosa's challenge. He had assumed that his primary responsibility as a father was financial provision and rule enforcement. But watching his sons transform under Rosa's guidance had shown him that children needed more complex forms of leadership. Jake and Danny were not just learning to control their anger. They were learning to see themselves as people with the capacity to influence their environment positively. They were developing confidence not just in their ability to fight, but in their ability to solve problems and help others solve problems. Marcus realized that he had been modeling a different kind of strength for most of their lives. His strength had been about domination and control, about bending the world to his will through superior resources and strategic thinking. But Rosa was teaching his sons that true strength was about service and protection, about using their capabilities to create rather than destroy. The next week brought a crisis that would test everything the family had learned. Marcus received a call informing him that Rodriguez Holdings was being investigated for potential securities violations related to a merger that had been completed 2 years earlier. The accusations were serious enough to trigger a federal inquiry, and the media attention was immediate and brutal. Marcus found himself working 18-hour days with lawyers and accountants, trying to demonstrate compliance with regulations he was not even sure he understood. The stress was overwhelming, and he fell back into old patterns of isolation and emotional withdrawal. He stopped participating in the morning training sessions and began taking meals in his office rather than with his sons. Jake and Danny responded to their father's absence with the regression Rosa had been expecting. Their old patterns of destructive behavior began to resurface, though in more controlled forms. Instead of destroying furniture, they began having loud arguments that escalated into pushing matches. Instead of attacking caregivers, they became defiant and uncooperative during training sessions. Rosa did not panic or increase discipline. Instead, she acknowledged what was happening and adjusted her approach accordingly. She shortened the training sessions and focused on basic breathing exercises rather than complex techniques. She increased the frequency of their emotional mapping activities and encouraged them to express their frustration through drawing rather than physical acting out. "Your dad is fighting a different kind of battle right now," she explained during one particularly difficult morning when both boys had refused to participate in any structured activities. "He's scared and angry just like you used to be, and he's dealing with it the same way you used to deal with it. By pushing everyone away and trying to handle everything alone. Is he going to be okay?" Jake asked with the worry that children try to hide when they sense adult vulnerability. "He's going to be fine. But he's forgotten some of the things you've been learning. He's letting his anger control him instead of controlling his anger. Can we help him?" Danny wanted to know. "Maybe. But first you have to help yourselves. You can't take care of someone else when your own emotions are out of control." Rosa's approach to this crisis was fundamentally different from how previous caregivers had handled family stress. She did not try to shield the boys from the reality of their father's situation or pretend that everything was normal. Instead, she treated it as an advanced lesson in emotional regulation under pressure. "This is what real life looks like sometimes," she told them. "People you care about face problems you can't solve for them. Your job is to stay strong and steady so you can be helpful instead of being another problem they have to worry about." The boys responded to this challenge with maturity that surprised even Rosa. They began monitoring their own emotional states more carefully and asking for help before their feelings escalated to problematic levels. They created a support system for each other, with Jake helping Danny recognize when his lightning anger was building and Danny helping Jake separate the different components of his storm cloud emotions. Most remarkably, they began leaving encouraging drawings outside their father's office door. Simple pictures with messages like "You are strong and we believe in you" that they created during their emotional mapping sessions. Marcus would find these offerings when he emerged from marathon strategy meetings, and each one felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in complexity and fear. 3 weeks into the crisis, Marcus had a breakthrough that came not from his lawyers or accountants but from something his 7-year-old son said during a rare family dinner. "Dad, your anger looks like a tornado now," Jake observed while studying his father's tense posture and clenched jaw. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, too exhausted to be anything but direct. "It's spinning really fast and picking up everything around it and throwing it everywhere. Rosa says tornado anger is the most dangerous kind because it destroys things you didn't mean to destroy." Danny nodded sagely. "You need to make it into a campfire. Campfires are warm and helpful, and they don't hurt people unless people are careless." Their innocent analysis contained more insight than hours of consultation with crisis management experts. Marcus realized that he had been approaching the investigation with the same destructive intensity that had once characterized his son's behavior. He had been fighting everything and everyone, including people who were trying to help him. That night, Marcus made a decision that his board of directors would probably consider insane. He asked Rosa if she would teach him the same emotional regulation techniques she had been teaching his sons. Not as a novelty or a gesture of solidarity, but as a serious student who recognized that he needed fundamental changes in how he approached conflict and stress. Rosa agreed, but with conditions that demonstrated her understanding of adult psychology and learning patterns. Marcus would train separately from his sons until he had mastered the basics. He would commit to daily practice regardless of his work schedule. And he would approach the learning with the same humility and openness to correction that she demanded from all her students. The next morning, Marcus found himself in his own dining room at 5:30, wearing athletic clothes and boxing gloves that felt foreign on his hands. Rosa worked with him the same way she worked with Jake and Danny, focusing on breathing and technique rather than power and aggression. "Your sons learn to fight their anger," she told him as she corrected his stance for the 10th time. "You need to learn to fight with your anger. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Fighting your anger means trying to eliminate it or suppress it. Fighting with your anger means using it as fuel for focused action. Your boys were letting their anger control them. You're trying to pretend yours doesn't exist." Marcus began to understand that his lifelong strategy of compartmentalization was not actually emotional control. It was emotional avoidance. He had been putting his feelings in boxes and ignoring them rather than learning to direct them constructively. The physical training was more challenging than he had expected. Not because the techniques were complex, but because they required a kind of present-moment awareness that was foreign to his multitasking, efficiency-focused mindset. He could not hit the bag effectively while thinking about quarterly projections or legal strategies. The activity demanded complete attention to the immediate physical experience. "Stop trying to solve your legal problems while you're training," Rosa instructed after watching him throw distracted punches for several minutes. "The bag doesn't care about your securities violations. Right now, there's just you and the target and the technique. Everything else can wait." This lesson in compartmentalization proved immediately applicable to his professional challenges. Marcus began approaching his legal meetings with the same focused attention he was learning to bring to his boxing training. Instead of allowing anxiety about potential outcomes to distract him from present-moment problem-solving, he learned to direct his energy toward the specific tasks that actually needed his attention. The change in Marcus's demeanor was apparent to everyone around him. His lawyers commented on his increased clarity and strategic thinking. His business partners noticed that he seemed less volatile and more collaborative in his approach to crisis management. Most importantly, his sons began to see him as someone who practiced the same principles he was asking them to embrace. The federal investigation was ultimately resolved without charges being filed, though the process took several months and required significant legal expenses. Throughout the ordeal, Marcus maintained his daily training routine and continued working with Rosa on emotional regulation techniques. He learned to treat stress as information rather than threat, to use his anger as fuel for productive action rather than destructive reaction. By the time the legal crisis was resolved, the Rodriguez family had developed a new foundation that was built on shared principles rather than traditional authority structures. Marcus had learned to lead by example rather than by command. Jake and Danny had learned to see challenges as opportunities for growth rather than threats to be eliminated through violence. The transformation was perhaps most visible in how they handled the inevitable conflicts that arose in daily life. When the boys disagreed about television programs or bedtime routines, they applied the problem-solving techniques they had learned in training. When Marcus faced business challenges, he used the same emotional regulation methods he had taught his sons to use with their anger. Rosa's presence in their lives had evolved from emergency intervention to ongoing guidance. She continued to live in the guest room and work with the family daily, but her role had expanded beyond childcare to something more resembling life coaching for all three Rodriguez men. The penthouse itself reflected their transformation. The formal dining room remained a training space, but it had been joined by other areas dedicated to family activities. The living room featured comfortable seating arranged for conversation rather than television viewing. The kitchen had become a gathering place where meals were shared and problems were discussed openly rather than avoided. Most significantly, Sarah's photographs had been integrated into the family's daily life rather than being preserved as untouchable memories. Her pictures were displayed throughout the penthouse, and her presence was acknowledged regularly in conversation. The boys had learned to talk about missing their mother without letting that grief control their behavior. "Mom would be proud of how we're taking care of each other," Jake said one evening as they cleaned up after a particularly successful training session. "She would be proud of Dad too," Danny added. "He learned how to make his anger into a campfire just like us." Marcus felt the truth of his son's observations settle into his chest like a warmth he had not experienced since Sarah's death. His family had not just survived their crisis. They had used it as raw material for building something stronger and more authentic than what they had lost. The story of their transformation began attracting attention from other families dealing with similar challenges. Rosa found herself consulting with parents whose children struggled with anger management, grief, and behavioral problems. She developed a waiting list of families seeking her services, though she remained selective about the cases she accepted. "Not every family is ready for this kind of work," she explained to Marcus when he suggested she might want to expand her practice. "It requires everyone to be willing to change, not just the kids. Most parents want their children to behave differently without examining their own patterns." Marcus understood what she meant. His own transformation had been as significant as his son's development. He had learned that true leadership required vulnerability and self-awareness, that strength was demonstrated through service rather than domination. The Rodriguez family had become something unprecedented in Marcus's experience, a team united by shared values rather than fear or obligation. They supported each other through challenges and celebrated each other's growth. They had learned to fight for each other rather than against each other. As Marcus watched his sons practice their techniques one morning, he realized that Rosa had given them something more valuable than anger management skills. She had given them a framework for approaching life as students rather than victims, as people with the capacity to grow and change rather than people trapped by their circumstances. The heavy bags still hung in the dining room, and the family still gathered there every morning for training. But the space had become more than a gym. It had become a laboratory where three people had learned to transform their pain into purpose, their anger into strength, their loss into love. The emergency call came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. Marcus jolted awake to his phone buzzing against the nightstand, the caller ID showing the name of Jake in Danny's school security office. His first instinct was dread, memories of countless middle-of-the-night calls about his son's destructive behavior flooding back despite months of progress. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Officer Martinez from Westfield Academy. There's been an incident involving your sons, but before you panic, they're not in trouble. They're actually heroes." Marcus sat up in bed, his brain struggling to process words that seemed to contradict everything he expected to hear about his children and nighttime phone calls from school officials. "What happened?" "There was a break-in attempt at the school tonight. Someone tried to force entry through the gymnasium windows. Your boys were here late for the science fair setup when they heard the noise. Instead of hiding or running, they used the school's emergency communication system to alert security and then position themselves to help evacuate other students who were still in the building." Marcus felt his chest tighten, not with the familiar anxiety of damage control, but with something closer to awe. "Are they hurt? Are they safe?" "They're completely fine. More than fine, actually. They handled the situation with remarkable calm and maturity. The would-be intruder fled when he realized the building wasn't empty, and thanks to your son's quick thinking, everyone got out safely before he could cause any real problems. After ending the call, Marcus found Rosa already awake in the hallway, having heard his phone ring. She was dressed and ready to go, car keys in her hand before he had even finished explaining the situation. They put their training to use, she said simply as they rode the elevator down to the parking garage. Real situation, real pressure, real choices. This is what we've been preparing for. When they arrived at the school, they found Jake and Danny sitting in the principal's office, no longer the defiant, destructive children who had once terrorized this same building. They were calm, alert, and clearly proud of their actions, but without the arrogant swagger that might have characterized their behavior in the past. "We remembered what you taught us about staying calm when scary things happen," Jake explained to Rosa as she knelt down to check on them. "We did the breathing thing and thought about what would help the most people." The security guard said we acted like we had training, Danny added with evident pride. "Like real training, not just kid stuff." Principal Harrison pulled Marcus aside while Rosa continued debriefing the boys. "Mr. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. When your sons first enrolled here, I honestly wondered if we were the right fit for their needs. Tonight proved that we were right to give them a chance to grow. They've become natural leaders." Marcus looked at his sons, who were demonstrating to Rosa how they had used hand signals to communicate silently with other students during the evacuation. These were the same children who had once used their coordination abilities to systematically destroy his penthouse and terrorize caregivers. Now they were using those same skills to protect their classmates. "What exactly did they do?" Marcus asked the principal. Jake took charge of getting the younger students to the designated safe area while Danny managed communication with our security office. They worked as a team, supporting each other while taking responsibility for different aspects of the emergency. Honestly, they performed better than some of our adult staff members have in similar situations. The ride home was quiet, but not with the tense silence that had once characterized their family interactions. This was the comfortable quiet of people who trusted each other, who knew they could speak when they had something important to say and remain silent when words weren't necessary. "Are you proud of us?" Danny asked as they rode the elevator up to the penthouse. "I'm proud of who you've become," Marcus replied, and realized that this was different from being proud of what they had done. Their actions at the school were impressive, but what moved him most was seeing how they had internalized the principles Rosa had taught them. They had become young men who chose courage over fear, service over selfishness. The next few days brought a parade of recognition that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The local news wanted to interview the young heroes who had helped prevent a school break-in. Other parents called to thank Marcus for raising sons who had protected their children. The school board issued a formal commendation recognizing Jake and Danny's leadership during a crisis. But Rosa seemed more interested in what the boys learned from the experience than in the accolades they received. "How did it feel when you first realized something was wrong?" she asked them during their next training session. "Scary," Jake admitted. "My storm cloud started forming really fast. But then I remembered the breathing exercise," Danny continued, "and the scary feeling changed into something else." "What did it change into?" "Focus," Danny said after thinking for a moment. "Like when we're training and you tell us to concentrate on our technique. Everything else got quiet and I could just think about what needed to happen next." Rosa nodded approvingly. "That's the difference between reacting and responding. You felt the fear, acknowledged it, and then chose your response instead of letting the fear choose for you." Marcus watched this debrief session with growing understanding of what Rosa had accomplished with his sons. She had not eliminated their intense emotions or their capacity for strong reactions. Instead, she had taught them to use those qualities as assets rather than liabilities. Their heightened awareness and quick reflexes, which had once made them destructive, now made them effective in crisis situations. "What would have happened if you had acted the way you used to act?" Rosa continued her questioning. "We probably would have tried to fight the burglar ourselves," Jake said with the wisdom of someone who had learned to recognize his own patterns. "And we would have gotten hurt and not helped anyone else get safe. The old US would have made everything worse," Danny agreed. we would have been part of the problem instead of part of the solution. This analysis demonstrated a level of self-awareness that impressed even Rosa. The boys had developed the ability to observe their own behavioral patterns and make conscious choices about how to respond to challenging situations. They understood the difference between their old reactive patterns and their new responsive capabilities. Over the following weeks, Marcus began noticing changes in how other people interacted with his family. The parents who had once avoided Jake and Danny now sought them out for their children's birthday parties and social events. Teachers who had once dreaded having the Rodriguez twins in their classes now requested them as peer mentors for other struggling students. The transformation was perhaps most evident in how the boys handled the ordinary conflicts of childhood. When disputes arose with their classmates, Jake and Danny had become the children others turned to for fair resolution. They had developed reputations as problem solvers rather than problem causers. It's like they've learned to see conflict as a puzzle to solve instead of a battle to win, Marcus observed to Rosa during one of their own training sessions, which had become a regular part of his routine. That's exactly right, Rosa confirmed as she adjusted his boxing stance. Most people approach conflict with the goal of being right or winning. Your boys have learned to approach it with the goal of finding solutions that work for everyone involved. Marcus had discovered that his own training sessions served multiple purposes beyond stress relief and physical fitness. The discipline required for boxing had improved his focus in business meetings. The breathing techniques helped him remain calm during difficult negotiations. Most importantly, the shared experience of learning from Rosa had created a deeper connection between him and his sons. "We're all students in the same school now," he had told his board of directors when they questioned his unusual new hobby. "My sons are teaching me as much as I'm teaching them." This comment had been more prophetic than Marcus realized at the time. Jake and Danny had indeed become his teachers in ways he was still discovering. They had shown him what courage looked like when it was motivated by service rather than conquest. They had demonstrated that strength could be gentle, that power could be protective rather than dominating. The boys' influence extended beyond their immediate family. Rosa had begun accepting consulting work with other families, and Jake and Danny often served as assistant instructors for younger children who were just beginning their own anger management training. They had learned to share their techniques with the same patience and encouragement Rosa had shown them. "Teaching helps us remember what we've learned," Jake explained when Marcus asked him how he felt about working with other children. "When I show someone else how to do the breathing exercise, I have to do it right myself." Marcus realized that his sons had discovered one of the fundamental principles of leadership, that true authority comes from service, and that the best way to master something is to teach it to others. They had moved from being recipients of help to being providers of help, from being problems that needed solving to being part of the solution for other families facing similar challenges. The penthouse had evolved to reflect their new family dynamic. The training room remained the heart of their daily routine, but other spaces had been adapted to support their growth in different ways. The living room featured a reading corner where the boys practiced the meditation techniques Rosa had taught them. The kitchen had become a gathering place for the informal counseling sessions that seemed to happen whenever other families visited seeking advice. Marcus had also made changes in his professional life that reflected his personal transformation. Rodriguez Holdings had begun partnering with youth organizations focused on anger management and conflict resolution. Marcus had established a foundation dedicated to providing physical training programs for children dealing with trauma and behavioral challenges. Business success means nothing if it doesn't contribute to something larger than profit, he had told his investors during a presentation about the company's new social responsibility initiatives. "My sons taught me that real strength is measured by how much you help others, not by how much you accumulate for yourself." These changes had initially concerned some of his business partners, who worried that Marcus was becoming soft or losing his competitive edge. But the opposite proved true. His new approach to leadership, based on principles he had learned in his dining room gymnasium, made him more effective in negotiations and more respected by his employees and competitors alike. The one-year anniversary of Rosa's arrival passed without formal celebration, but not without recognition. Marcus found himself reflecting on how completely their lives had changed, how thoroughly they had been transformed from a broken family barely holding together into a unified team with shared values and mutual support. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found Rosa?" Jake asked during one of their evening conversations. Marcus considered the question seriously. Without Rosa's intervention, he suspected that Jake and Danny would have continued down a path towards serious behavioral problems, possibly ending up in therapeutic boarding schools or juvenile detention facilities. His own career would likely have suffered as he struggled to manage their increasingly destructive behavior. The family would have remained fractured, held together only by legal obligation rather than genuine connection. "I think we would have lost each other," Marcus answered honestly. "Not just as a family, but as individuals. We were all so angry and scared that we couldn't see past our own pain to help each other. Rosa helped us see that we were on the same team," Danny added. "Even when it felt like we were fighting against each other, we were really fighting for the same things." That evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He called Rosa into his home office and offered her a permanent position not just as his son's caregiver, but as a member of their family. Not romantically, but as someone who had earned a place in their lives through her contributions to their growth and healing. "I know this is unconventional," he said, "but conventional approaches failed us completely. You've given us something more valuable than childcare or even therapy. You've given us a foundation for living that we can build on for the rest of our lives." Rosa's acceptance was characteristically straightforward. "This family still has work to do. Jake and Danny are going to face new challenges as they get older. You're going to face tests of everything you've learned. I'm not finished with any of you yet." Her response made Marcus laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly Rosa. She had never been interested in praise or gratitude for its own sake. She was interested in results, in continued growth, in the ongoing work of becoming better people. As Marcus tucked his sons into bed that night, he realized that they had achieved something he had never thought possible after Sarah's death. They had not just rebuilt their family. They had built a better family than they had been before their tragedy. Their loss had taught them to value what they still had. Their anger had taught them the importance of emotional regulation. Their chaos had taught them to appreciate order and purpose. "Dad," Danny said as Marcus turned off the bedroom light, "do you think Mom would be proud of how we turned out?" Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied thoughts of Sarah, but it was no longer the crushing weight it had once been. It was simply love, transformed by grief into something deeper and more precious than what it had been when she was alive. "I think she would be amazed," he replied. "I think she would be proud not just of who you've become, but of how hard you worked to become it." The next morning brought another call from the school, but this time it was an invitation rather than a crisis report. The principal wanted to know if Jake and Danny would be willing to speak at the school's annual Character Education Assembly, sharing their story of transformation with other students who might be struggling with anger and behavioral problems. Marcus watched his sons consider the invitation with the same serious attention they brought to all important decisions. They discussed the potential benefits and challenges of sharing their personal experiences publicly. They weighed their desire to help other children against their natural preference for privacy. "We should do it," Jake concluded after their deliberation. "If our story can help even one kid learn that they don't have to stay angry forever, then it's worth being a little uncomfortable." Besides, Danny added with a grin, "Rosa always says the best way to learn something is to teach it to someone else." As Marcus drove them to school that morning, he realized that the cycle was complete. His sons had moved from being recipients of help to being providers of help, from being problems that needed solving to being part of the solution for other families facing similar challenges. They had learned not just to control their anger, but to transform it into a force for positive change in their community. The assembly was scheduled for the following month, giving Jake and Danny time to prepare their presentation with Rosa's guidance. They decided to focus on the practical techniques they had learned rather than the dramatic details of their transformation, understanding that other children needed tools they could use rather than just inspirational stories. Marcus found himself looking forward to seeing his sons share their hard-won wisdom with their peers. The children who had once been the source of emergency phone calls and disciplinary meetings would now be standing on a stage, teaching other young people about courage, self-control, and the possibility of change. The Rodriguez family had discovered that healing was not just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something stronger and more beautiful from the pieces that remained. They had learned that anger could be fuel rather than fire, that strength could be gentle, and that the most powerful victories were won not over others, but over the parts of themselves that had once seemed unchangeable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.